Welcome back to History for Hours. Tonight we drift through the late-night streets of New York, where confidence carried as much weight as power and reputation was built in full view of the city lights. This is the world of John Gotti, a man who refused the shadows, turning leadership into theater and authority into style, where respect was displayed, not whispered, and every move was made under watchful eyes, demanding a balance of charm, nerve, and relentless self-belief that few could sustain. Not because of fear, but because living so visibly meant never lowering your guard. So before we settle in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if you truly enjoy these long, slow journeys through history's darker corners. And if you're listening right now, drop a comment with your location and local time, because I love knowing where these stories travel. Now dim the lights, let the city noise fade, and ease into the bold, restless story of John Gotti, the man who ruled the night in plain sight. The rain on Fulton Street in East New York had a way of making the whole neighborhood feel like a forgotten corner of the world. It wasn't a storm, just a steady, cold drizzle that turned the pavement into a black mirror and dripped relentlessly from the torn awnings of social clubs and storefronts. In a dimly lit bar, the kind where the air was thick with cigarette smoke and old regrets, a young John Gotti was just beginning to understand that he wasn't made for the shadows. He was in his early 20s, already carrying himself with a confidence that seemed too big for the cramped room. His hair was carefully styled, his jacket, though not yet the $1,000 suits of his future, was sharp and clean, a stark contrast to the worn sweaters and scuffed shoes of the older men around him. He was there on business, a simple collection for a Gambino family associate, but he conducted it like a performance. The debtor, a middle-aged man who ran a failing hardware store, sat trembling at a corner table. The older soldier with Gotti, a man named Rocco who had seen decades of such conversations, leaned in and spoke in low, gravelly tones about obligation and consequence. It was effective, straightforward. But Gotti, growing impatient with the man's stammered excuses, finally cut in. He didn't just repeat the threat. He leaned back, his eyes locked on the shopkeeper, and told him a story. He talked about the neighborhood, about how everyone had a role to play, a contribution to make to the ecosystem of the streets. He spoke about respect not as something you demanded, but as something you cultivated through reliability. A man's word is his bond, Gotti said, his voice calm but intense, each word deliberate. Out there, in the rain, nobody cares if you fail, but in here, we care. We remember. You want to be the guy who's remembered as reliable, or the guy who's remembered as a problem? The shopkeeper, mesmerized and terrified by the twisted logic and the charisma behind, it fumbled for his wallet. The money was produced. As they left, Rocco shook his head, lighting a cigarette under the scant shelter of the doorway. You give a sermon, John. We're not priests. We're collectors. Sermons take time. Time is attention we don't need. Gotti flashed his famous grin, the one that would later charm and intimidate tabloid photographers. Rocco, they forget the number. They never forget the story. That was the essence of John Joseph Gotti Jr. even then. Born in 1940, the fifth of 13 children in a poor Italian-American home, the streets of South Bronx and later East New York were his true classrooms. He dropped out of school at 16, running with a gang called the Fulton Rockaway Boys. He wasn't the biggest or the strongest, but he was fearless and fiercely loyal to those he considered his own. He had a quick, street-smart intelligence and a temper that could ignite like a flash fire. More than anything, he had an undeniable presence, a magnetism that drew people in and a will that pushed events to bend around him. His formal entry into the life came through Carmine Fatico, a capo in the growing Gambino crime family who operated out of the Bergen Hunt and Fish Social Club in Ozone Park, Queens. Fatico saw something in the brash young man: guts, ambition, and a work ethic. Gotti started at the bottom, hijacking trucks at Idlewild Airport, now JFK, running errands, collecting bets. He was good at it. He was relentless and unafraid of violence, but he also had a knack for the operational side, for understanding how the pieces of a criminal enterprise fit together. He also had a knack for trouble. In 1968, he served a short prison sentence for hijacking. It was a rite of passage, but it also cemented his reputation as a reliable earner who could keep his mouth shut. By the late 1970s, he was a made man and a capo running the Bergen crew. He was bringing in millions through construction rackets, gambling, and loan sharking. He was respected, feared, and wealthy. But there was a problem, a fundamental crack in the world he inhabited. The boss of the Gambino family was now Paul Castellano, a man who lived in a stately Tudor mansion on Staten Island. Big Paul was old school in a different way. He saw the future of the mafia in white-collar crime. Wall Street scams, sophisticated fraud, the skimming of millions from major corporations. He viewed street crews like Gotti's, with their hijackings, barroom shakedowns, and flashy jewelry, as vulgar, dangerous, and embarrassingly low-class. He saw Gotti himself as a loudmouth thug, an unnecessary risk. Gotti, in turn, saw Castellano as a privileged hypocrite who lived in a palace built on money earned by the sweat and blood of soldiers like him. He resented the disrespect, the slights, the way Castellano seemed ashamed of the very men who formed the family's backbone. The tension was a slow-burning fuse, snaking through the underworld. And then, in 1980, a personal tragedy lit a match. Gotti's 12-year-old son, Frank, was killed in a devastating accident, struck by a car driven by a neighbor, John Favara. The death was ruled an accident, but in Gotti's world of absolute loyalty and brutal revenge, such distinctions were meaningless. Favara was harassed, threatened, and months later, he vanished, never to be seen again. The murder of a civilian, especially one connected to such a public tragedy, was a monumental breach of protocol. It brought massive police scrutiny and horrified the conservative Castellano. To the boss, it was the final, irrevocable proof that John Gotti was a wild animal, a liability who would destroy the family to feed his own ego and grief. From that moment on, Gotti was a dead man walking in the eyes of the administration. He knew it. Every car that slowed near his social club, every unfamiliar face on the street, could be the end. But John Gotti didn't believe in waiting for the end. He believed in writing it himself. The cold rain of Brooklyn turned to the icy sleet of a New York winter. He stood outside the Rave Night Social Club in Little Italy, a new, more powerful base. He looked up and down Mulberry Street, not with paranoia, but with calculation. The fuse was burning down. The only question left was who would control the explosion. The quiet guys, as Rocco said, might live longer. But John Gotti was done being quiet. He was ready for everyone to remember his name, no matter the cost. The pressure after his son Frank's death didn't break John Gotti. It forged him into something harder, sharper, and more dangerous. The grief was a private storm, but the public response, the disappearance of John Favara, was a declaration of war on the rules themselves. In the world of La Cosa Nostra, where bosses demanded order and discretion, Gotti had staged a chaotic, deeply personal opera of revenge. Paul Castellano, sitting in his mansion on Staten Island, wasn't just angry. He was disgusted. This was the very brand of messy, emotional, headline-grabbing violence he was trying to move the family away from. For Gotti, survival now meant more than just watching his back. It meant building a wall of loyal men between himself and Castellano's wrath. He turned the Bergen crew in Ozone Park into a fortress. These were his people, street guys from Queens and Brooklyn who saw Gotti not as a vulgar thug, but as a man of honor, a leader who put his crew and his blood above all else. While Castellano dined with corrupt executives and talked of stock swindles, Gotti was on the street, in the clubs, handing out envelopes of cash to soldiers who had family troubles, showing up at weddings and funerals, being a visible, accessible boss. He was cultivating a myth, and the myth was potent. John Gotti was a man of the people, in contrast to the remote, aristocratic Castellano. He also made a strategic alliance that would prove crucial. He deepened his bond with Salvatore "Sammy the Bull" Gravano, a mobster from Brooklyn who was, in many ways, his opposite. Where Gotti was flash and fire, Gravano was ice and calculation. Gravano was a prolific earner, a master of the construction and cement industry rackets that were the lifeblood of the family's income. He respected Gotti's strength and loyalty, but was often privately exasperated by his boss's love of the spotlight. Yet, Gravano was also deeply distrustful of Castellano, who he felt looked down on the hard-working earners. Gotti and Gravano formed a pact. They would protect each other, and if the time came, they would move together. Castellano, meanwhile, was tightening the noose. He began to openly criticize Gotti's crew, withholding funds, interfering in their operations. He made it known through channels that he was considering shelving Gotti, stripping him of his crew and putting him in a powerless, retired status, which in their world was often a prelude to a death sentence. The tension was an open secret, humming through the social clubs of New York. The breaking point, ironically, came from the law, not the mob. In 1985, Castellano and his underboss, Thomas Bellotti, were indicted on a massive racketeering charge. The case, built by the relentless prosecutor Rudolph Giuliani, threatened to put Big Paul away for life. As the trial approached, Castellano grew increasingly paranoid. He knew he was vulnerable. Whispers began to circulate that he was talking to the government, seeking a deal to save himself. Whether these whispers were true or planted by Gotti's faction didn't matter. In the paranoid ecosystem of the mafia, the suspicion alone was a death warrant. Gotti saw his moment. The boss was weak, distracted, and accused of the ultimate sin, cooperation. He convened a secret meeting with his inner circle, including Gravano and his trusted brother, Gene. The room was thick with tension. This wasn't just about killing a rival. It was about assassinating the boss of the family, an act that required approval from the Mafia's National Commission, which they did not have. It was the highest crime, a coup that could spark a civil war. Gotti made his case, not with a fiery speech, but with cold, street-level logic. "He's gonna flip to save his mansion," Gotti said, his voice low. "He looks at us like we're dirt on his shoe. Now he's got the feds on him, and he's gonna drag the whole family down with him to save his own skin. He's already dead. He just don't know it yet. We gotta make it official." The plan was audacious. They would hit Castellano in the heart of Manhattan, outside Sparks Steakhouse, a place he frequented. It was a location chosen for its symbolism as much as its practicality. A show of strength in the open, a message that there was no safe place. On the cold, clear evening of December 16, 1985, John Gotti and Sammy Gravano sat in a parked car on 2nd Avenue watching. They saw Castellano's black Lincoln pull up. They saw him and Bellotti step out onto the sidewalk, bundled against the cold. They saw the hit team approach. The shots were quick, clinical. Castellano and Bellotti fell. As chaos erupted, screams, sirens in the distance. Gotti and Gravano drove calmly away. An hour later, Gotti walked into the Rave Night Social Club. He was met not with somber silence, but with a subdued electric buzz. He had not just committed murder, he had changed the natural order. He took his usual seat. A glass of scotch was placed before him. He didn't toast. He simply looked around the room, meeting the eyes of each man, and gave a slow, deliberate nod. The message was received. The street had taken the palace. The Dapper Don was born that night, not from an election, but from an execution. But as he sipped his drink, the weight of what he had done settled on him. He was now the boss of the nation's most powerful mafia family. He had also made himself the single biggest target for every law enforcement agency in America. The spotlight he craved was about to become a blinding, inescapable glare. He had won his throne, but the walls of his kingdom were now made of glass, and everyone was watching. The weeks following the Sparks Steakhouse murders were a strange, suspended interval in the underworld. There was no war. No rival faction rose to challenge John Gotti's brazen coup. Instead, a quiet, stunned acceptance settled over the Gambino family. The old guard, those loyal to Castellano's vision, were either too afraid, too pragmatic, or too disillusioned to fight. The street crews, long feeling marginalized, saw one of their own seize the crown. Gotti's audacity was interpreted as strength. In the absence of a countermove, his power became fact. He moved quickly to solidify his rule. He was officially recognized by the other families in a series of quiet post-facto meetings. The commission, though furious at the breach of protocol, had little choice. A war to avenge Castellano would have been catastrophic for everyone. It was easier to accept the new, volatile reality. Gotti promoted his loyalists. His brother Gene became a key advisor. Frank DeCicco, who had helped orchestrate the hit, was named underboss. And Sammy Gravano, the strategic mastermind whose construction rackets were the family's financial engine, was elevated to consigliere. It was a new administration, built on loyalty and shared risk. But Gotti's vision of being boss was radically different from his predecessors. Carlo Gambino and Paul Castellano had ruled from shadows and stately homes. Gotti ruled from the sidewalk. He held court at the Rave Night Social Club on Mulberry Street in Little Italy almost nightly. He didn't hide, he performed. The club, once a discreet meeting place, became a stage. He would stand outside, rain or shine, holding impromptu press conferences with the tabloid reporters and TV crews who now staked him out daily. He wore his fame like one of his Brioni suits, tailored, expensive, and impossible to ignore. To the working-class people of Little Italy and Ozone Park, he became a folk hero. He was the guy who told the feds to get lost with a smirk, who gave turkeys to the poor at Thanksgiving, who waved to neighbors from his car. He was John, a local boy made good on his own terms, a symbol of defiance against a system many felt had failed them. This public adoration was a drug for Gotti, and he inhaled it deeply. It validated his belief that the old, quiet ways were obsolete. Behind the glittering facade, however, the cracks were already forming. The first fissure was with his own underboss, Frank DeCicco. Just months after the takeover, DeCicco was killed by a car bomb meant for Gotti. The attack was retaliation from the Castellano loyalists, a reminder that not everyone had accepted the new order. Gotti was shaken, not just by the loss, but by the message. He was vulnerable. It made him more paranoid, more reliant on his inner circle, and more publicly belligerent as a show of unshaken strength. The second, deeper crack was with Sammy Gravano. Sammy, the businessman, watched Gotti's media circus with growing dread. Every flashbulb, every headline was a beacon for law enforcement. Gravano believed in making money quietly, in building empires of concrete and steel that attracted no attention. Gotti believed the attention was the power. He began to make decisions based on ego, not economics. He launched reckless, personal wars against other mobsters who disrespected him, wars that were bad for business. He insisted on being consulted on every minor decision, creating bottlenecks. Gravano, sitting in meetings, would listen to Gotti rant about respect and reputation, and his mind would be calculating the lost revenue, the unnecessary risk. The law, of course, was not idle. The FBI's focus on Gotti became an obsession. They couldn't touch him for the Castellano hit. Witnesses were terrified. Evidence was circumstantial. So they attacked from the flanks. They indicted him in 1986 for racketeering, but the case was built on the testimony of a turncoat whose credibility was shredded. Gotti walked out of the courtroom with that famous grin, waving to the crowds the Teflon Don, to whom no charge would stick, but the victory made him reckless. He believed his own legend. If the FBI couldn't get him with their best shot, they couldn't get him at all. He didn't see the quieter, more meticulous trap being laid. While he basked in the spotlight outside the rave night, a team of FBI agents was renting an apartment directly across the street. They planted hidden microphones in the club's hallway and in the apartment upstairs where Gotti sometimes took private meetings. They weren't just listening for talk of murders. They were listening for everything, the conversations about day-to-day business, the arguments over money, the casual insults, the proof that John Gotti was the boss of a criminal enterprise. Gotti, the master performer, didn't know his most important stage was bugged. He held meetings in those tapped rooms, speaking freely, believing in the inviolable sanctity of his social club. He was creating word by arrogant word, the testimony that would undo him. One chilly evening in 1989, standing outside the rave night after another acquittal had sparked a block party in Little Italy, Gotti turned to Gravano. The TV lights lit up his proud, defiant face. "You see this, Sammy?" he said, gesturing to the celebrating crowd. "This is respect. This is what it's all about." Gravano looked at the crowd, then at the dark, anonymous windows of the building across the street. He forced a smile and nodded, but inside he felt a cold certainty. This wasn't respect. It was a funeral procession, and John Gotti was dancing in the lead car, mistaking the noise for applause. The boss had conquered the underworld, but in doing so, he had built his own prison, with the walls made of sound waves and his own voice providing the bricks. The fall wouldn't come from a rival's bullet. It would come from a transcript. The Teflon Don moniker was a crown John Gotti wore with immense pride. Every acquittal, every charges dismissed headline wasn't just a legal victory. It was a myth-making event, proof that his will was stronger than the entire justice system. The celebration outside the rave night after the 1987 racketeering case fell apart was particularly sweet. His lawyer, the brilliant and flamboyant Bruce Cutler, had eviscerated the government's witnesses, painting them as liars and losers. Gotti emerged, not with a sigh of relief, but with a conqueror's swagger, embracing Cutler like a winning general. The image was electric. The untouchable boss and his fearless lawyer, mocking the system. But inside the rave night, in the cramped back room where the real business happened, a different reality was curdling. The constant surveillance was a tax on every operation. Simple meetings became logistical nightmares. The FBI wasn't just watching. They were demonstrating their watchfulness, a psychological siege meant to provoke mistakes. And Gotti, fueled by his victories, began making them. His management style grew more autocratic and impulsive. He demanded a share of everything, even small street operations, not just for the money, but as a symbol of control. He settled disputes not with the cool arbitration of a boss, but with the hot temper of a neighborhood tough. A soldier who showed up 5 minutes late for a meeting might be subjected to a furious, humiliating tirade about respect in front of his peers. The loyalty he had cultivated began to strain under the weight of his ego. The most dangerous strain was with Sammy Gravano. Sammy's construction rackets were complex, delicate operations involving legitimate businessmen, union officials, and layers of paperwork. They required stability and a low profile. Gotti's need for constant drama and his habit of starting petty feuds with other families created chaos. Law enforcement pressure would spike, banks would get nervous, deals would stall. One afternoon, in the apartment above the rave night, a place Gotti considered a secure haven for sensitive talks, he and Gravano argued over a stalled multi-million-dollar concrete contract. Gravano, his voice tight, explained that the developers were getting spooked by the headlines. "They see your face on the news every night, John. They hear the word racketeering. They're businessmen. They want quiet partners." Gotti waved a dismissive hand, his pinky ring catching the light. "They want strong partners, Sammy. They want winners. My face on the news tells them we're winners, that we can't be touched." "That's not how it works," Gravano insisted, a rare flash of frustration breaking through his icy calm. "They don't want a winner who's in a circus. They want a winner who shows up, gets the job done, and is invisible. This spotlight, it's burning the money." Gotti's eyes darkened. He saw the complaint not as a business assessment, but as a challenge to his authority, an insult to his hard-won fame. "The business is what I say it is," he said, his voice dropping to a dangerous register. "You handle the concrete. I'll handle our reputation. Don't forget who built this." The conversation was captured in pristine clarity by the FBI microphone hidden in the ceiling. For the agents listening, it was gold. It wasn't just evidence of criminal enterprise. It was a map of the fracture lines within the empire. They heard the boss's arrogance and the underlings' simmering resentment. The legal net, woven from thousands of hours of these secretly recorded conversations, was nearing completion. The agents had moved beyond the hallway bug. They had penetrated the inner sanctum. They heard Gotti planning shifts in family leadership, discussing the murder of a troublesome union delegate, laughing about past crimes. They heard his casual cruelty and his towering vanity. The Teflon coating was being dissolved, not by a dramatic witness, but by the acid of his own voice. Gotti, oblivious, continued his public performance. He began to believe his own invincibility was a force of nature. He started to sideline Bruce Cutler, whose theatrical defenses were now being viewed by judges as potentially complicit. Gotti felt he knew the law better than the lawyers. He'd beaten it before. He would beat it again. In late 1990, the government struck with a new, sweeping indictment. This one felt different. The charges were familiar: racketeering, conspiracy to murder, obstruction of justice. But the atmosphere was grim. The prosecutors were quiet, methodical. They didn't give fiery press conferences. They just filed thousands of pages of evidence, including sealed transcripts. The judge, reflecting the government's argument about Cutler's potential role as an unindicted co-conspirator, removed him from the case. Gotti was furious. It was the first chink in his armor he couldn't buff out with bravado. The trial was set for early 1992. As jury selection began, Gotti held court at the rave night one last time. He was still defiant, telling his crew the government had nothing but ghosts and gossip. But the celebratory crowds outside had thinned. The neighborhood sensed a shift in the weather. The performance was starting to feel like a eulogy. Across town, in a secure federal office, prosecutors and FBI agents were preparing their star witness. They didn't need a turncoat from a rival crew. They had something far more powerful. The boss's own words, hours and hours of them, talking about every facet of his criminal life. And they had something else, too. The carefully nurtured, coldly calculated betrayal of Salvatore Gravano, who had looked at the crumbling empire, listened to the arrogant rants on the FBI tapes, and decided the winning side was no longer the man in the Brioni suit, but the men with the transcript. John Gotti walked into the federal courthouse in Brooklyn for the start of the trial, his suit impeccable, his chin held high. He believed he was walking into another arena he would dominate. He didn't realize he was walking onto a stage where his own voice would be played back to him, line by damning line, and where the man who had helped him build his throne was now the architect of his downfall. The spotlight was finally exactly where he wanted it, but the script was no longer his to write. The federal courtroom in Brooklyn was a stage set for a different kind of performance. The wood-paneled walls absorbed sound, giving the space a hushed, solemn gravity that felt alien to John Gotti. This wasn't the roaring, open-air theater of Mulberry Street. Here, the audience was a hand-picked jury of strangers. The script was federal law, and the director was a judge who looked upon him not with fear or admiration, but with weary impartiality. Gotti, flanked by his new, less flamboyant lawyers, sat at the defense table, his posture radiating a combative confidence. He believed the government's case was another house of cards, built on the unreliable word of low-level informants. He was ready for Bruce Cutler's fiery style, for the dramatic confrontations he'd won before. He was not ready for what came next. The prosecution's opening statement was delivered not with a shout, but with the quiet precision of a surgeon making an incision. The prosecutor outlined a case not of hearsay, but of autobiography. He told the jury they would hear the defendant's own voice, in his own words, detailing his crimes. Gotti's smirk faltered for a fraction of a second. His own voice? How? The answer came in the form of a tape recorder. When the prosecution called its first technical witness, an FBI audio specialist, and began to play the recordings from the rave night, the air seemed to leave the room. The sound was clear, intimate, terrifying. There was John Gotti's distinctive, raspy Queen's accent, filling the silent courtroom. He wasn't talking about the weather. He was talking about pieces of work, coded talk for murders. He was criticizing a soldier's lack of respect. He was discussing the division of spoils from a hijacking. He was unmistakably the boss. Gotti sat perfectly still, his eyes fixed on the small speaker as if it were a venomous snake. For the first time in his very public life, he looked trapped. The walls of the social club, which he believed offered sanctuary, had become a recording studio for his own confession. Every laugh, every curse, every casual order was now evidence. The Teflon wasn't repelling charges. It was being used to play them back to him. The tapes were the foundation. The wrecking ball was named Salvatore Gravano. When Sammy the Bull was called to the stand, a ripple went through the courtroom. Gotti's head turned slowly. His eyes met Gravano's, and in that exchange was a universe of betrayed history. The shared plot against Castellano, the years of building an empire, the private arguments in the Ravenites' upstairs apartment. Gravano held the gaze for a moment, his face an unreadable mask, then looked away, settling into the witness chair. Gravano's testimony was a masterpiece of cold demolition. He spoke without hesitation, without visible emotion. He wasn't a hysterical informant. He was a former CEO detailing the corrupt inner workings of a corporation. He named names, dates, and dollar amounts. He described Gotti's role in authorizing murders, including that of the union delegate. He explained the structure of the Gambino family with the clarity of an organizational chart. Most damningly, he gave context to the tapes, interpreting the coded language, confirming that when Gotti said, "that thing we discussed," he meant murder. Gotti's lawyers attacked Gravano's credibility, painting him as a murderer saving his own skin. But Gravano had already admitted to 19 murders. His willingness to confess his own crimes gave his testimony a perverse, undeniable. Wait, he wasn't hiding, he was trading. And what he traded was John Gotti. As the days wore on, Gotti's defiant posture began to erode. The smirk vanished, replaced by a stony, impassive mask. He spent hours scribbling notes to his lawyers, but the frantic energy was that of a general whose maps had been stolen by the enemy. He could see the jury's faces, no longer curious, but grim, their eyes moving from the calm, confessing Gravano to the tapes, to him. The final, symbolic blow came during a particularly brutal tape. It was a conversation between Gotti and Gravano, arguing about the very construction racket Sammy had run. On the tape, Gotti's voice was arrogant, dismissive. "You handle the concrete, I'll handle our reputation." In the courtroom, Gravano, from the stand, explained how that arrogance had jeopardized millions. The jury listened to the boss belittle his most important earner, and then watched that earner, calm and collected, dismantle the boss's entire world. In that moment, the mythology John Gotti had so carefully crafted shattered. He wasn't the untouchable dapper Don, a Robin Hood of the streets. He was a man on a tape, petty and bullying. He wasn't a brilliant strategist outwitting the feds. He was a man who had talked himself into a life sentence, his most trusted advisor now the state's star witness. The respect he coveted had curdled into revulsion in the eyes of the law, and the loyalty he demanded had been purchased by the government for a lesser sentence. When the guilty verdict was read, Gotti did not erupt. He simply closed his eyes for a long moment, as if absorbing a physical impact. When he opened them, he looked not at the judge, nor at the prosecutors, but at the empty space where Gravano had sat. There was no anger left, only a cold, profound understanding. He had built his kingdom on a foundation of loud defiance and personal loyalty. The defiance had been recorded, and the loyalty had been for sale. The performance was over. The spotlight, at last, showed only a man in a suit, alone, with nothing left to say. He was no longer Teflon. He was just John Gotti, convict. And the walls that closed in on him were made of his own words. The heavy door of the U.S. Penitentiary in Marion, Illinois, closed behind John Gotti with a finality that echoed differently than a cell door in his youth. Marion was the end of the line, a super-maximum security facility designed to hold the most disruptive prisoners in complete isolation. For the man who had drawn energy from crowds, who had fed on the noise of the street and the flash of cameras, the silence was a new kind of sentence. His world shrank from the 5 boroughs to a concrete box. 23 hours a day in a cell. 1 hour of solitary exercise in a cage. No contact with other inmates. His meals were slipped through a slot. The only voices were the occasional, impersonal commands of the guards. The Brioni suits were replaced by an orange jumpsuit. The meticulous hair fell lank without its salon products. The physical transformation was swift, but the psychological unraveling was slower, more profound. The government, fearing he would continue to rule the Gambino family from prison, had placed him under special administrative measures, SAMs. His phone calls were severely limited and monitored. His mail was read and censored. His visitors, outside of his lawyers and immediate family, were forbidden. He was cut off not just from society, but from the very universe of influence he had built. The boss who demanded daily reports now had to beg for a newspaper. The irony was a constant, bitter companion. The prison was filled with men, inmates and guards alike, who knew exactly who he was. But here, his notoriety granted him no privilege, only tighter scrutiny. The fear he once commanded was replaced by a clinical, bureaucratic control. He was a specimen under glass, and the lesson was relentless. The power had never been in him. It had been in the system he temporarily hijacked. The system had reclaimed its asset and filed it away in the deepest drawer. His health began to fail. The years of high living, the stress of his wars, and the suffocating inertia of prison took their toll. He developed throat cancer, a brutal irony for a man whose voice had been his weapon and his undoing. Treatment in prison was a grim, impersonal process. The proud head that had never bowed to a rival now had to be held still for radiation machines operated by technicians who saw just another inmate number. From his isolation, he watched the empire crumble. Without his galvanizing, chaotic presence, and with the devastating testimony of Gravano and the tapes, the Gambino family fragmented. The old captains he had bullied or marginalized saw their chance. The street crews, once fiercely loyal, now answered to new, quieter voices or splintered into independent factions. The construction rackets that were the financial engine were dismantled by relentless RICO prosecutions, many based on the blueprint Gravano had provided. The name Gotti was no longer one to conjure with. It was a warning, a symbol of a bygone era of dangerous flash that had ended in ruin. His family on the outside became his only tether to the world, and their struggles were a private agony. His son, John A. Jr. Gotti, attempted to step into his father's shoes, but the world had changed. The FBI's focus was unrelenting, and Jr. lacked his father's dark magnetism and street credibility. He faced a series of racketeering trials himself, a cyclical nightmare of indictments and mistrials that drained the family's finances and spirit. Gotti, from his cell, could only offer frustrated advice in monitored phone calls, a general trying to direct a war through a keyhole. In his rare, heavily supervised meetings with his wife, Victoria, the strain was palpable. The woman who had stood by him through decades of chaos now faced a life sentence of her own, one of waiting, worry, and visiting rooms. The bravado that had once charmed her fell flat in the sterile prison conference room. The man before her was diminished, a ghost of the force of nature she had married. John Gotti spent his final years in a medical prison in Springfield, Missouri. The cancer, in remission for a time, returned. The treatments grew more desperate, the pain more constant. The once indomitable will was now focused on a single, daily battle against an enemy no amount of intimidation could sway. He died on June 10, 2002, at age 61. The news was announced not from the steps of the Rave Night, but in a terse press release from the Federal Bureau of Prisons. There were no crowds in Little Italy, no television specials celebrating his defiance. The funeral was a large, somber family affair in Queens, guarded by police who were there to manage spectators, not to pay respects. The legacy of John Gotti was left to the historians and the tabloids. He had achieved the fame he craved, but it was a cautionary fame. He was remembered not as the untouchable Teflon Don, but as the man whose love for the spotlight illuminated the inner workings of the mafia for the FBI, leading to its most devastating defeat. He proved that, in the modern age, the loudest voice in the room isn't the most powerful. It's simply the easiest to record. The boss who wanted to be a king ended his life as a lesson that the highest price for the throne isn't paid in blood or money, but in the absolute, silent solitude of a cell, where the only audience for your performance is the echo of your own regrets. The years after John Gotti's death did not bring silence, but a strange, dissonant chorus. The man was gone, but the echo of his life reverberated through the streets he once ruled, through courtrooms, and through the very culture of America. In the quiet, tree-lined streets of Howard Beach, Queens, the Gotti family home stood as a monument to a contradiction, a place of ordinary. Himself, but by creating an environment where his most trusted lieutenant, Sammy Gravano, found it not only acceptable but advantageous to do so. He had, in their view, egoistically invited the law into their living room and then handed them a blueprint. Because of him, an old, retired wise guy was rumored to have muttered, "We got microphones in our lamps and business partners wearing wires." He turned a business into a reality show. The cultural image of Gotti, however, took on a life of its own. In popular culture, he was often stripped of his complexity and violence, polished into a symbol of stylish defiance. He was the guy in the great suit who laughed at the government. This sanitized, cartoonish version was easier to digest. It overlooked the ruined lives, the fear he instilled, the cold-blooded orders he gave. This myth-making would have infuriated the lawmen who put him away, but it would have also secretly pleased Gotti himself. He had always understood the power of image over substance. Perhaps the most profound and personal legacy was the one written in the solitude of a prison medical ward. In his final, diminished years, disconnected from the roar of the city and the adrenaline of power, John Gotti was left with only the consequences. The throat cancer that stole his voice felt like a grim, cosmic punchline. The man whose words had built and then destroyed his empire was ultimately silenced by a disease. The interviews he gave from prison near the end were revealing. The bravado was muted, replaced by a defensive, almost plaintive tone. He claimed he was just a man who loved his family, a gambler who got in over his head. It was a bid for a simpler narrative, a final attempt to control his story. But the story was already written. It was written in the FBI transcripts, in Gravano's testimony, in the obituaries that labeled him a gangster, not a folk hero. It was written in the closed social clubs and the vacant lots where his construction rackets once flourished. It was written in the wary eyes of his grandchildren, who would grow up with a famous last name and a history they could neither escape nor fully understand. John Gotti's life was a grand, tragic paradox. He sought a crown and won a cage. He desired respect and orchestrated his own humiliation. He wanted to be remembered as a king, and he is remembered as a lesson. The final, quiet truth of his story is that the loudest life can end in the most profound silence, and the pursuit of a legend can leave behind nothing but a warning, etched not in stone, but in the collective memory of a city that watched him rise and watched him fall, learning that in the end, the brightest flames are always the first to burn out, leaving only smoke and ash. The concrete landscape of Marion and later the sterile medical unit in Springfield became John Gotti's entire world. In the suffocating silence of administrative segregation, time lost its meaning. Days bled into months, then years, marked only by the clang of meal slots, the infrequent monitored calls, and the worsening cycles of pain from the cancer growing in his throat. The fierce energy that once powered him now had nowhere to go, turning inward into a corrosive stew of regret, defiance, and a profound, unacknowledged loneliness. He was allowed a small, portable television. The news clips he saw were a surreal funhouse mirror of his former life. He watched as the city moved on. The Rave Night Social Club, his stage, had been sealed and abandoned by the family, a toxic asset. His old haunts in Ozone Park were now just blocks in a changing city. The politicians he'd once intimidated with a look were now retired or indicted themselves on different charges. The world was rewriting itself without him, and the erasure was more painful than any indictment. His communications with the outside were his only tether. The conversations with his wife, Victoria, were exercises in coded language and strained normalcy. They discussed family, health, mundane details, while everything unsaid. The appeals lost, the friends turned informants, the slow financial bleed of legal battles, hung in the static of the prison phone line. Her visits, when granted, were conducted through thick glass, speaking on handsets, a cruel parody of connection. He could see the weariness in her eyes, the strength it took to maintain her composure for him. The man who had promised her a life of excitement and privilege had delivered a life of siege. The most complex relationship was with his son, John A. Jr. Their phone calls were often fraught. Jr., thrust into a leadership role he never truly wanted, was struggling under the crushing weight of the name and the relentless gaze of the FBI. He sought his father's counsel, but the advice Gotti gave was from a different era, advice on loyalty, on strength, on facing down enemies. It was ill-suited for a landscape dominated by RICO statutes, cooperators like Gravano, and a digital trail. Gotti would grow frustrated, his voice, weakened by the cancer but still sharp with intent, rasping instructions that felt increasingly like ancient history. He couldn't comprehend that the rules of the game had been permanently changed, in large part by him. Within the Gambino family, what was left of it, his name became a curse. The old money rackets in construction and waste hauling were decimated by prosecutions. The flashy, street-level crew he championed was decimated, its members imprisoned or flipped. The surviving power brokers, those who avoided the dragnet, were men who had deliberately cultivated invisibility. They blamed Gotti for the heat, for the microphones, for making the life a public spectacle. In their view, he hadn't been a strong boss. He'd been a catastrophic liability. Any lingering mystique was buried under an avalanche of resentment from the very soldiers he claimed to represent. And then the cancer moved into its final, aggressive phase. The treatments were brutal and humiliating. The proud man who never showed weakness was reduced to a patient, dependent on prison orderlies, wasting away in a regulated medical bed. In his final, pain-riddled days, his thoughts were a private domain no wiretap could reach. Did he think of the long-ago streets of East New York, of the simple clarity of a fistfight? Did he hear the laughter in the Bergen Club, or the roar of the crowd outside the courthouse? Or was it just the silence and the face of Sammy Gravano on a witness stand that played on a loop? He died as he had lived his last decade, in custody. The official announcement was clinical. There was no massive street funeral, no procession of black Cadillacs. The family service was private, heavy with grief and the watchful eyes of law enforcement ensuring it remained just that. A funeral, not a rally. In the days that followed, the obituaries tried to summarize the contradiction. He was a gangster who loved his family, a brutal killer who gave turkeys to the poor, a man of the street who craved the society pages. The dapper Don was laid to rest, but the myth he sculpted was just beginning its own separate journey. John Gotti, the man, was gone. John Gotti, the idea, a warning, a symbol, a twisted emblem of ambition, was now public property, ready to be used, debated, and immortalized in ways he could have never controlled. The performance was finally over, but the audience kept talking about the show. The earth over John Gotti's grave in St. John's Cemetery in Queens had barely settled before the battle for his legacy began. A battle fought not with guns, but with subpoenas, book deals, and television cameras. The man was gone, but the story of the dapper Don became a contested inheritance, a source of both burden and opportunity for those he left behind. For his family, the immediate years were a tightrope walk between grief and self-preservation. Victoria Gotti, the stoic wife who had endured decades of chaos, now faced a new challenge, managing the commercial weight of the Gotti name. There were offers for interviews, for endorsements, for rights to their story. The family's finances, drained by endless legal battles, created a pressure that was both practical and painful. They lived in a gilded cage of their own, the house in Howard Beach, a museum to a life they could neither fully embrace nor entirely escape. The most public struggle was carried by his son, John A. Jr. Gotti. Jr. became the heir to a war he didn't start. The federal government, having felled the father, was determined to ensure the son would not resurrect the dynasty. Jr. was thrust into a grueling cycle of indictments and trials. Each proceeding felt like a macabre reenactment. The same tapes of his father's voice-filled courtrooms. The same themes of racketeering and murder were argued. But the world had changed. The mythic, untouchable figure at the center of the previous drama was absent, replaced by a younger man who seemed, at times, more like a hostage to his last name than a feared crime boss. The trials of Junior Gotti resulted in a series of mistrials. Juries deadlocked, unable to reach a unanimous verdict. For the government, it was frustration. For the Gotti family, it was a Pyrrhic, exhausting victory. A life spent in the limelight of accusation without the resolution of acquittal. The legal purgatory took its toll, painting a picture not of invincibility, but of a legacy so toxic it poisoned any chance for a normal life. Junior's fight was less about winning power and more about escaping a shadow. Within the hollowed-out structure of the Gambino family, Gotti's reign was analyzed with cold, brutal hindsight. To the few old-timers who remained and the new, cautious leaders who emerged from the wreckage, he was the prime example of what not to do. The lessons were clear. Avoid the press. Keep meetings mobile and silent. Prioritize steady, invisible profit over dramatic scores. The Gotti model of leadership was studied as a blueprint for disaster. His insistence on personal glorification had provided the FBI with a fixed target and a treasure trove of evidence. The modern mafia, what was left of it, retreated further into the gray areas of finance and cybercrime, led by men whose names would never grace a tabloid headline. Yet, in the broader culture, the Gotti legend underwent a strange distillation. The complexity, the violence, the ruined lives, the emotional toll on his family, was often sanded away, leaving a simpler, more romantic figure, the sharp-dressed rebel who tweaked the nose of authority. This version flourished in pop culture, in casual references, in the endless true crime documentaries that favored style over substance. This cultural afterlife would have been deeply satisfying to the man himself, even as it would have infuriated the law enforcement officials who broke him. He had always understood that image could eclipse reality. Perhaps the most telling postscript was the silence from the once vibrant streets of Little Italy and Ozone Park. The social clubs that had buzzed with activity were shuttered or repurposed. The generations that came after saw the Gotti story not as inspiration, but as an ancient, cautionary history lesson, a tale of a bygone New York. The localized, neighborhood-based power he represented was rendered obsolete by globalization, digital surveillance, and a city that had physically and economically transformed. John Gotti's true legacy was thus a series of endings. He presided over the end of the mob's glamour era. His life marked the end of the idea that a charismatic individual could openly defy the federal justice system and win. And for his own bloodline, his choices precipitated the end of any chance for anonymity or peace. The empire he seized with such audacity did not pass to his heirs. It dissolved into court transcripts, mistrial headlines, and cultural myth. The boss, who fought for respect and remembrance, got both, but in forms he could never have controlled. As a footnote in legal history, a warning in criminal circles, and a caricature in popular entertainment. The final victory did not belong to Gotti, or even to the prosecutors. It belonged to time, which slowly buried the reality of the man under the weight of his own outsized and ultimately futile legend. The story of John Gotti does not end with a bang, but with a series of quiet, relentless echoes. Years after his death, the final chapter of his legacy is written not in headlines, but in the subtle, unyielding weight of consequences. It is a story of a paradox. The man who sought to build an eternal name succeeded only in ensuring it would be forever chained to his failure. In the tidy, middle-class neighborhood of Howard Beach, the Gotti family home stands as it always has, a symbol of normalcy that forever masks its tumultuous past. For Victoria and the children, the world gradually learned to live with a quieter kind of scrutiny. The frenzy faded, replaced by a lingering, watchful curiosity. They carried the name, a name that opened some doors and slammed many more shut, a name that was both an inheritance and a life sentence. The glamour and power their patriarch had chased ultimately left them with a more complicated bequest: the burden of history. The American mafia, the institution Gotti longed to rule and redefine, rendered its own final verdict on his reign. In the cold, practical analysis of surviving organized crime, he is not a legend but a case study in catastrophic mismanagement. He is the reason why meetings are now held in moving cars, why conversations are conducted in walks on the beach, and why flashy displays of wealth are considered the mark of a fool or a target. He proved that the greatest threat to the secret society was not an outside force, but an insider who loved the spotlight too much. The Gotti era is referenced in hushed tones as a dark age, a period of unnecessary risk that nearly burned the whole enterprise down. And yet, in the broader cultural imagination, a different Gotti endures. Stripped of his violence and cruelty, sanded down to a simple, rebellious silhouette, he becomes the Teflon Don, a folk anti-hero. This version lives on in documentaries, in true crime podcasts, in the stylized gangsters of film and television who wear $2,000 suits and smirk at the camera. This Gotti is a convenient fiction, a symbol of defiance against the system, a character whose complexity is sacrificed for a cleaner, more entertaining narrative. It is the ultimate irony. The man who craved respect from his peers is instead granted a kind of hollow fame by the society he held in contempt. But perhaps the most profound and lasting legacy of John Gotti is found in a simple, undeniable principle he demonstrated for all the world to see. That in the modern age, the loudest voice in the room is not the most powerful, but the most vulnerable. His belief that he could outshine the system, that his personality was a shield, was his fatal flaw. The microphones in the rave night didn't just capture a crime boss. They captured the sound of an outdated philosophy colliding with a new, technological reality. He was the last of a breed, a dinosaur who didn't comprehend that the climate had changed. His grave in Queens is visited by family, and occasionally by the curious. It is a polished stone marker among many others, a final, humble resting place for a man who desired a monument. The real monument to John Gotti is not made of granite. It is the thousands of pages of FBI transcripts. It is the witness protection files holding the identities of those who betrayed him. It is the legal precedent that locked him away. It is the wary silence that replaced the boisterous noise of his social clubs. He wanted to be a king, but he became a lesson. He sought a legacy of strength, but left behind a blueprint for downfall. In the end, the story of John Gotti is a timeless American parable about the price of pride and the illusion of control. It reminds us that the most dazzling performances often have the darkest final acts, and that the pursuit of a legend can sometimes leave behind nothing but a warning, whispering from the silent streets of a city that never forgets, even when it tries to forgive. The curtain fell, the audience moved on, but the echo of his ambition, and its spectacular collapse, remains a permanent footnote in the long, complicated story of power and its many disguises. The final, unyielding truth about John Gotti settled not with a judge's gavel or a headline, but with the slow, quiet passage of time. In the end, his story resolved into a series of immutable facts, a ledger where the costs far outweighed the gains. The man who devoted his life to crafting a myth was ultimately defined by the realities he could not control. For his family, the inheritance was a permanent duality. They carried a name that was globally recognized, yet it was a name that spoke of a past they could neither change nor fully escape. The notoriety brought a certain grim currency, book deals, television interest, but it was a currency that required them to endlessly mine their own pain and privacy. Their father and husband had sought to make the Gotti name powerful. Instead, he made it a brand, one synonymous with a specific, tragic kind of American ambition. Their lives became a permanent negotiation with that brand, an effort to carve out spaces of normalcy in a world that would always see them first through the lens of his infamy. Within the cold, pragmatic ecosystem of organized crime, Gotti's reign was dissected and filed away as an object lesson in operational failure. To the new generation, those few who still moved in those shadows, he was not the dapper Don, but the loud one. His tenure was a masterclass in what to avoid: the fixation on personal image, the centralization of risk, the contempt for low-profile profit. The systems he disdained, secrecy, patience, insulation, were the very systems that survived him. The mob, in its reduced and pressurized form, learned from his mistakes, becoming quieter, more virtual, and more anonymous. His legacy there was not one of inspiration, but of vaccination. His example inoculated the life against the virus of his own personality. In the vast arena of popular culture, his image underwent its final, complete transformation. Stripped of blood and consequence, he became a stock character, the charming gangster in the fine suit. This version was palatable, a symbol of rebellious style rather than of real-world violence and corruption. This cultural ghost would have pleased the part of him that craved applause, even as it would have enraged the part that demanded fearful respect. He had become entertainment, a fate perhaps more dismissive than obscurity. And so, the paradox of John Gotti is cemented. He is remembered, but not as he wished. He is famous, but for his failure. He sought a throne and built a stage, only to discover that the spotlight he loved was, in fact, an interrogation lamp. His physical grave is marked by a simple stone, but his true monument is less tangible and more pervasive. It exists in the stringent protocols of witness security programs, strengthened in the wake of cases like his. It exists in the FBI's playbook on how to dismantle a personality-driven criminal enterprise. It exists in the quiet, cautious habits of those who still operate on the wrong side of the law, for whom doing a Gotti means making a vain, reckless mistake. The most enduring lesson of his life is a simple, modern proverb he proved with devastating clarity. In an age of surveillance and systems, the loudest voice in the room isn't the most powerful. It's simply the easiest to record, to isolate, and to silence. The strength he worshipped, the strength of the street and the defiant public stance, was rendered obsolete by the patient, impersonal power of the state. He fought a war of personality against an institution that had no personality, only process, and he lost completely. The story of John Gotti concludes not with a moral, but with a confirmed fact. You can seize power through audacity. You can capture the public's imagination with style and defiance. But if that power is built on sand, and that imagination is fed on illusion, the end is not a dramatic fall, but a gradual, inexorable sinking. The final sound is not a gunshot or a cheer, but the quiet, decisive click of a tape recorder stopping, having captured everything that needed to be said, leaving only silence in its wake.